समझ नहीं आ रहा अपने सैलरी इंक्रीमेंट का क्या करूं।
बेटा इतना क्या सोच रहा है, अपने म्यूचुअल फंड्स के एसआईपी का टॉप अप करा ले। दिस इज द राइट टाइम।
क्या समझ में नहीं आया?
बेटा इतना क्या सोच रहा है, अपने म्यूचुअल फंड्स का एसआईपी टॉप अप करा ले। दिस इज द राइट टाइम।
अब समझा।
Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme-related documents carefully.
More than 2 months after Air India 171 crashed, a few seconds after taking off from Ahmedabad, the families, the victims, are no closer to any answers. In the meantime, as often happens in these cases, the headline has tragically fallen off our front pages, our prime time, leaving the families and the victims alone to grapple with the mounting questions about what caused the crash. In the midst of all this, a highly contentious and widely criticized preliminary investigation report left us all with more questions than it did answers. Now, at least 95 families have decided to sue Boeing in their quest for both answers and justice. And in a moment from now, we'll be talking to the senior aviation attorney from the United States of America who's representing these families in court and taking on Boeing. I'm Barkha Dutt. You're with the Mojo Story. These are images that scarred a nation, that jolted the world. The crash of Air India 171 right after it took off from Ahmedabad. The plane was headed for London. Parts of the plane rammed into a medical college, killing those on ground as well. The questions have mounted, especially after a highly contentious and debated preliminary investigation report that referred mostly vaguely to a conversation that took place in the cockpit between Captain Sumeet and Captain Clive, referencing evidently the transitioning of the fuel control switches from run mode to cutoff mode. No actual transcript of the cockpit conversation has been released either in that report or otherwise. There have also been mounting questions about the condition in which the black boxes, as they're colloquially called, were found, including damage to the rear one that led many aviation experts to focus on the lithium batteries. But contentiously, the preliminary investigation report gave a clean chit to Boeing, and by summarizing and decontextualizing a part of a conversation that took place in the cockpit, the report left the door wide open for the pilots who were no longer alive to defend themselves to be blamed. This is where we stand today, with a mountain of questions and very few answers. Imagine what that means for the victims of the crash. Well, one man, a senior aviation attorney based out of the United States of America, has now decided to represent at least some of these families, 95 of them at last count, in court. I want to welcome to the program our newsmaker today. Mike Andrews is with us. He's a senior attorney with Beasley Allen. He is, as I mentioned, the lawyer representing 95 of these families in a legal petition against Boeing, looking for answers as well as justice. Thank you very much, Mike, for your time. I think it's very important to contextualize that you also represented victims in the 737 MAX Ethiopian air crash. And why that crash is so important is because the crash preceding it of the Lion Air 737 had also seen a similar finger pointing at the pilots. And it took the reality of the Ethiopian air crash for Boeing to acknowledge that there was actually a mistake in its design, the MCAS system that the pilots flying the planes were never told about. And you know, it was that case that really pushed Boeing on the defensive and got them to acknowledge the truth. So you have some experience doing this. Talk a little bit about the importance of the case you've just taken on.
Sure, and thank you. So aviation safety affects all of us. One of the things that we've seen in all too tragic detail in this incident is that even individuals who are on the ground or in a nearby building can be affected by failures or faults in aviation safety. Certainly, it affects the flying public, but it can affect everyone. And it also stands for the larger proposition of corporate accountability and governance and transparency in information in cases like this.
And I think you've had some experience with the fact that it's not unusual and it's often easy to point a finger at the pilots, most after a devastating air crash, because they're not even alive to make their own case. We have not seen in the case of Air India 171 anyone officially come out and say, except for the Wall Street Journal and Reuters, that it is the pilots who are responsible. But we have seen speculation because of a very open-ended statement in the preliminary investigation report that spoke of the fuel control switches, a conversation about the fuel control switches transitioning from run to cutoff mode. And one pilot saying to the other, "Did you do that?" And the other pilot saying, "No, I did not." And I'm summarizing here because the CVR, the cockpit voice recorder conversation, is not actually available verbatim. I want you to talk about what went through your head when you looked at how the report had articulated this and why that has led to so much speculation, particularly in sections of American media, that the pilots were to blame, leading to great outrage and pain here in the aviation community.
Yeah, and I think you've hit at the heart of the matter right now. Typically, in a case in which whatever the failure is on an aircraft, if everyone survives, the pilots survive, the pilots are generally not blamed. Data can be downloaded, and we've certainly seen more recent incidents in the last month involving 787s, including one that happened back in 2019, in which everyone survived. The data was downloaded and was determined to be an uncommanded or an automated computer response issue that was not initiated by the pilots. That underscores the fact that you cannot take a small snippet of information and infer exactly what happened in this case. Think of it as a keyhole view into a very large room of information. You can only see and focus on the very small piece that you can see through the keyhole. Taking a piece of data out of context and inferring that the pilots committed suicide and mass murder is improper at this point, because all of the data is not known. It's unfair. And keep this in mind, the pilots were also killed. So their families are grieving as well. If in fact it is shown that the equipment suffered a failure here, then that's just heaping insult to injury to blame the pilots and their families for something that they had no control over. So you are right. It's improper to take a small piece of data out of context and infer a larger cause until we know all of the data.
Let's in fact talk about the example that you just mentioned. In 2019, an ANA aircraft, also a 787, suffered or experienced a dual engine failure as it touched down. And this was not commanded by the pilots. It was exactly what you referenced, an uncommanded action that took place. In other words, nothing the pilots did physically led to this dual engine failure. And I am assuming that it is your research, your submission, that is at least one of the theories that has to be looked at in the context of Air India 171.
You're right. This is an extremely complicated aircraft. It's been billed as the most complex electrically driven consumer or civilian aircraft ever. And so because of that, it is designed to have multiple redundancies. You have multiple redundancies in both engines, in various parts of the hydraulic system, and certainly in the electrical systems. And so you should never have a dual engine failure. Now, in the case that you've just referenced, the Osaka flight, again, the pilots survived. No one was injured on the landing, even though you had a dual engine failure. So the pilots were not blamed. The data was downloaded, and it was determined that something with the TCMA, the throttle control malfunctioning accommodation system, which is essentially a safety backup system, something malfunctioned there. It either believed the plane was already on the ground and shut the power, or one of the other questions we have is, was there an electrical short or fault somewhere that may have triggered this? Because of some of the things we know about the way the electrical bus system operates on this aircraft, we have questions whether an electrical short can trigger sort of a reset here that could cause this. But in any event, what happened is there's a system called the FADEC, which is the Full Authority Digital Engine Control System. It operates in concert with this TCMA system to give full control over the power settings of the engines. Now, when you talk about an uncommanded or an uncalled for input, what you're talking about is something that is happening that the pilots are not doing themselves, that an automated computer system is calling for. And so in that case, we understand the computer system called for the shutdown of both engines on landing. Obviously, the question then is, did something like that occur in Air India? And if so, what initiated or what precipitated that? Is it something that it did just on its own due to a fault, or was there an electrical short, perhaps caused by, as we've been discussing more recently, water leaks that have been noted in the 787s in critical areas involving the electronic equipment and the EE bays, which is where the computer equipment is maintained. So yes, we have questions whether or not what happened with the Osaka flight parallels some of the things that we're seeing here. Certainly, the largest thing that jumps out at us is the dual engine failure.
Yeah. So you mentioned a few different things. I want to start with the water leaks. In fact, we have an FAA directive on this. We have an FAA directive talking about the water leaks and how the water leaks in turn can impact the safety of the electrical functioning of this plane. And we also have to remember that the 787 is a highly electric plane. I think somebody called it a computer in the sky. So let's talk about this FAA warning on water leaks and why you're specifically looking at it in the context of 787 and the AI-17 crash.
Well, you're right. I think it is probably correct to characterize this as a computer that flies. It's the most complex computer electrically driven aircraft that we know of right now. And the FAA directives, as well as Boeing documents that are available online, all indicate that the water lines, specifically water couplings of water lines in the forward and aft lavatories and galleries, leak. And they leak specifically because there's essentially a clamshell coupling that fits over the junction of two water lines where they come together. There's a flanged edge. Where those fit together, a coupling fits around that. And then it has a closure mechanism. Around that, there is a sheath or a covering, right? The way I understand it, when that sheath or covering is fitted back into place, it can cause that latch mechanism to loosen. And in turn, those lines can leak. Now, Boeing issued a close to a 300-page document that details exactly where these couplings are, the part numbers, and the replacement part numbers. And essentially, the replacement, the alternative design, is such that it has a strap, a retaining strap, that holds the closure mechanism closed to prevent it from loosening and leaking. Now, that is significant because anyone who has ever had water get in their phone understands that electronics and water don't usually mix well together. We understand that in the FAA directives as well as the Boeing information, these water leaks can occur in areas that can lead to electrical shorts and specifically can lead to the possibility of losing flight critical computer systems as a result of the electrical shorts.
We just pulled out the directive, and I'm just going to read out a portion of it. This is specifically on the water leaks. This is an airworthiness directive, albeit it is for the 787, 8, 9, and 10 models of the 787. And it says that the airworthiness directive was prompted by reports of water leakage from the potable water system due to improperly installed waterline couplings, just what you were explaining. And it goes on to basically say that the FAA is issuing this AD to address the unsafe condition on these products.
That's right. And you've hit, that's a large part of it now. And there are a couple of different important things to note in what you've just pulled up. One is it does speak to the leaking waterline couplings. Now, further in the directive and then in a supplemental directive, they go back to qualify to say that they aren't sure if it's an improper installation or if it's a design defect. They go on later to say, no, we think this is a defect in the way this is manufactured, or at least in the coupling itself. So it speaks about a source, right, of being of water leaking from the couplings, but it also speaks in that directive to the failure to install waterproofing materials in those critical areas. And then the unsafe condition section that you've just pulled up there underscores exactly what I said a few moments ago. It can cause equipments in the EE bays to become wet, resulting in an electrical short and potential loss of system functions essential for safe flight. Now, I think it's also important to note that this all began from actual reports in the field. We understand from some of the directives that equipment had to be replaced on various aircraft because water was leaking into it. Now, we don't have full details on what the equipment was or what the effect of those leaks were on that equipment, but we know that this was important enough for not only the FAA to issue more than one directive or bulletin, but also for Boeing to issue a very detailed, nearly 300-page report on specifically how it is to be replaced, all the areas that are to be replaced and inspected, and including the man hours and how much it will cost for all of this work to be done.
Now, this is one aspect that investigators and people like yourselves will look at and ask answers of. Aviation experts that I've been interviewing over the last couple of months have also urged us to look at the condition in which what we colloquially call the black boxes, the FTRs, were recovered. And this plane, of course, has two, one in the front and the second in the rear. And a number of experts have argued, and this fits in somewhere with your theory of an electrical short, that the condition in which the rear black box is recovered points to some sort of problem with the lithium-ion batteries. The 787 has had these problems before, and that these images on your screen, which is of the AI-171 flight data recorders, is typically not how you find, this is not the condition in which you find the flight data recorders. And I'm just wondering if you had a chance to look at this aspect.
We have looked at that. I'm aware of those reports in the media. And what you have to remember is that every crash is unique. The dynamics and certainly a post-crash fire are always unique in every incident. So sometimes you can look at post-crash data like the photographs that you see on the screen there and say, this may or may not be typical of what a normal or a typical fire would be. The problem is we don't know what else may have affected the fire pattern or the burn pattern, which again gets us back to the importance of the data, right? And so one of the things that we can get from the flight data recorder, from the forward and the aft recorder, assuming that information is all available, is a timeline. And that is more important than anything for us. And it's important for a number of reasons. First and foremost, we need to know when the RAT, the ram air turbine, deployed relative to any of these other things that are occurring. We can determine a timeline in the aircraft based on a number of things. You can use what's sometimes referred to as Zulu time from when the mic is keyed for air traffic control. But you can also take the data in the flight data recorder and establish an independent timeline relative to certain points. And here's what I mean by that. There is a switch in the aircraft known as the WOW switch. It's the weight on wheels switch, and it's the way the aircraft knows whether or not it's in contact with the ground. So if, for example, you have good data from the flight data recorder, you could take the exact time that the weight on wheels switch is activated in the front gear and use that as a time zero. And from that, begin to plot when other things are occurring. Because what we know is, absent some mechanical failure of a closure, the RAT is only supposed to deploy in 3 or 4 very specific, very narrow set of circumstances. For example, if you lose both engines, right? If you lose total electrical power, or if you lose hydraulic power, then the RAT should deploy. Now, another instance is if the pilots intentionally deploy the RAT. That's another way it can be deployed. And then more recently in the news, we've seen reports where apparently there were substandard component parts used in some 787 aircraft for the rat closure mechanism. Essentially,
Substandard titanium. We'd actually reported on that.
that's correct. As I understand it, titanium is very, very strong, but it can be very brittle. And because of that, in certain applications, you need to have an alloy which can add to more malleability or more flexibility, less brittleness over time. Apparently, a more pure form of titanium may have been used on some of the closure mechanisms, which led to failures in flight and the rat deploying when it should not have. But getting back to the significance of the timeline and why that is important in looking at the rear flight data recorder, and it's simply this: when did things happen relative to the rat deployment? What is it that is happening that is causing the rat to deploy, right? Is there an electrical failure that is occurring somewhere that is causing the rat to deploy? And that can get back to your question regarding batteries. For example, if there was a battery issue on the plane, if there were a battery fire. Now, we've not seen any other indication of that other than the photographs that you just mentioned that call into question the condition of that recorder in the rear of the plane. But that is one possibility if you have an electrical interruption or an electrical short that triggers the changeover of the electrical bus system, which brings me to another point that I'll talk about in a second. But we need to be able to establish an accurate timeline. Because again, anyone at this point who would speculate that it is the pilot solely at fault is guessing, just as if I were to stand here and say it is solely Boeing's fault, because we don't have all the evidence. That's improper. That's not the way you conduct an investigation, by looking at out of context, small snippets of information. You need to have the whole picture in order to see what's happening. And so to get me back to the issue that I started to talk about on the electrical bus system, think about, not everyone has an electrical generator, for example, at their home for backup power or solar power. But some people will have a battery backup on their computer, if you've got an APU or a surge protector. All right. So if you lose primary electrical power, there is a brief second, millisecond, 2 seconds, whatever the delay period is, when it switches over from the primary power to the backup power. Right? There's a brief pause. Sometimes it can reset a computer. Sometimes the lights in the house can dim and come back on. That very same thing can happen in the electrical bus system of the 787, the way we understand that its architecture works. And here's why that's important. The way I understand the electrical architecture of the primary and the emergency bus systems in the 787 is that if there is a failure in the electrical system and it switches over from primary to emergency backup or to the emergency bus with only critical systems, the question is, will one of the pilots lose the lights on his control panel, right? And so is it going to happen such that only one pilot has a lit display and one does not? Which then raises the question, is the cockpit voice recorder referring to the fuel switches, or is it referring to, why did I lose my control panel lights? Why did you cut my lights? Right? Again, these are speculations. This is conjecture. That's why it is so important to get all of the data, because there's so many possible things that could have gone wrong here.
I want to just take you back to the rat for just a moment, right? I think the big gap in the preliminary investigation report is that we do not have an exact timestamp for when the rat deployed.
Exactly.
Right? And without knowing at precisely what time in this 32-second journey of this plane the rat deploys, we will not be able to answer in what circumstances. Because so even if we know when the fuel control switches, if they transitioned, and I'll come to that in a moment at all, what we need to know is, did the rat deploy before that? The insinuation has been one of the pilots physically moved the fuel control switch from run to cut off, the engines failed, then the other pilot tried to revive it. But what we do not know in the middle of all of this purported sequence of events, when did the rat deploy? Could you explain to our audience why it's so critical to know that exact time?
Sure. What you're trying to learn is which is the chicken and which is the egg, which came first.
Exactly. Exactly.
And what you're trying to get at is what's referred to as a root cause analysis. Think of some people are familiar with Christmas tree lights, a strand of lights that would go on a tree. Sometimes, at least in my household over the years, half of one of those strands will go out, right? Part of it's working, part of it's not. Each of those bulbs that is not working is a problem, but it's also a symptom, right?
Yeah.
Because each of those is not the primary cause. And so most people have learned over the years as you trace back to the first bulb that is out, and more often than not, if you replace that bulb, all of the rest come on because that was the root cause. That was the primary fault or the primary failure. Now, apply that analogy to a very complicated system like the 787. You've got all of these various automated controls that are doing something. They're calling for commands, they're looking at sensors, but the question becomes, what is the initiating event? What is the first or what is the primary fault? What's the root cause here that has caused this? And so you've just hit on the very issue of the timeline of the rat deployment. And more specifically, just before that, what caused the rat to deploy? That's really the question. What caused the rat to deploy? Did the rat deploy because there was a problem with the fuel switches, because there was a problem with the FADEC or the TCMA? Did it deploy because there was an electrical short, which could have been caused by a battery issue or an emergency bus issue or water in a computer? What was the precipitating event? You're exactly right. That is the question. And we need that accurate timeline to determine what happens first. That will help us to figure out the root cause of what happened here.
Before I sort of end with asking you about, how you're thinking of your legal battle, I do want to address the elephant in the room, which is the fuel control switches. The entire sort of finger pointing, whether whispered or otherwise, at the two pilots in command of AI 171 is based on this one sentence in the preliminary investigation report about the fuel control switches transitioning from run to cutoff. And you have already said that without the actual transcript of the CVR, we don't actually even know if the pilots are talking about the fuel control switches or whether they're talking about their control panel. The other important thing that I think you could explain to our audience is that the flight data recorder will not tell you whether someone physically moved this switch or not. Even if the switch is moved, it doesn't actually tell you that somebody physically in some suicide mission moved the switch. And I think that's really important to understand. So if you could just speak to that, please.
Yeah, that's very important to understand. And really to understand the explanation, you have to know just a very, very little bit about how switches work. And here's a simple way to describe that. Think of a lamp cord that runs to the plug in your home. There's two wires in that lamp cord, right? In order to shut that light on and off without unplugging it every time, you cut one wire, not both, just one, and pull those wires apart. Now the light goes off. If you want that to come back on, you touch those wires back together. It's very simple, on or off. Now, that's what a switch does, but in a housing that is insulated so it protects you from being shocked. It's an on and off. But what it's doing, it's moving a section of contacts, on or off, right? Yeah. Now, apply that to the way these fuel switches work. These switches are more complicated in that they have a safety device that is built in that you're supposed to pull the switch out, move it up, and push it back in. That is a mechanical block that is there to prevent, hopefully, inadvertent movement of the switches. It's because it's so important that they be protected. Now, your question is the cockpit voice or the flight data recorder going to accurately tell us whether that switch mechanically moved or whether it's a current change? And the answer is it's not looking at the mechanical movement of the switch at all. If you
Yeah.
look on the screen, you've got a graphic there of those
Yeah.
switches. There is not a camera there positioned looking at those switches to tell you that a finger or something moved that switch.
Correct.
In fact, what it's looking at is the current change in there. And so it is altogether possible that an electrical short in this system initiated a change in that current. And what we may be seeing in the flight data recorder is simply a reflection of the current change and not the fact that the switch moved. Which brings me to another point. There is at least a small snippet of information in that preliminary report that the switches were actually cycled afterwards. That 10 seconds or so after all this, the switches were switched off and back on.
I think the second switch to come back on takes 14 seconds on or some later.
That's right.
Like that.
That's right.
Yeah.
There's a period of time there. And so here's what we know. For a memory action item, for things that pilots are trained to do automatically, they don't really think through, they don't have to look at a checklist, they just know to do. One of those things, in this case, would be the old IT trick of unplug it and plug it back in, right? You've always been told if your computer doesn't work, unplug it and plug it
That's
back
right.
in. Well, that's a similar
right.
thing here. It's to switch it off and switch it back on. So it's altogether possible that this second movement was by hand as an attempt to reset or restart the system, which, by the way, is contrary to a suicide narrative. If the pilots are attempting to commit suicide, why would you try to relight the engine? Why would you try to restart and control the aircraft? That is completely contrary to that narrative. So it's possible that the first event may have resulted from a short or a computer fault, and the second is the human trying to overcome that or reset that system.
That's very clear. So the first happens as a result of an electrical short, possibly. And the second attempt is to physically restart them. And that, by the way, is in the Boeing, from what I understand, is in the SOP manual of Boeing that you do physically try and do, basically like we do in life. You turn something off and you turn it on again to see if it would work.
Right.
I want to ask you in the end, Mike, you actually made a trip to Ahmedabad. You made a trip, you came to India. Why was it important for you to do that, and what did you pick up?
Well, for me, in all the years of my practice, it's always been important for me to see as much of the actual evidence as I can firsthand. Photographs are great, video is great, but being there present, meeting with families in person is always more important to me, because you get, there's always so much to get in context when you meet with people in their homes or at the crash site. And certainly I visited the site twice. The first was while there was still a pretty heavy police presence on scene. And we visited and saw the area, actually learned that we were standing in the area where the lone survivor came out, which was Mr. Vishwas Kumar Ramesh, standing in that area. And so while we were there, we were able to see the burns areas. We were able to see the devastation and the extent of the area. But certainly during the second visit, we were there for a candlelight vigil in which the families organized and invited us to attend in remembrance at the 2-month anniversary. So again, it's just important for me as an attorney to get all of the context and to meet people where it happened and learn their stories, because, each life is unique. Each family is unique. And to me, that's what all this is about.
Finally, in the absence of publicly available data, because as you've said, we do not have the transcript of the cockpit voice recorder, we do not have a lot of information right now. Could you, as the attorney representing these families, actually be able to access this data through, let's say, American transport agencies that have had access to the investigation? How is this legally going to work, and how do you address those who have skepticism that Boeing somehow always manages to to cut a deal. For example, it's escaped penalties by settling with the administration in the United States of America. This is after its CEO has admitted to serious security lapses while testifying to Senate and Congress. So I want you to tell us what happens now. How are you actually going to build this case? Will you be able to access data? And how do you address this question of this behemoth called Boeing with a dodgy, to put it mildly, security record?
Sure. So it's a very complicated and complex fight to obtain any data in any crash. Sometimes in smaller aircraft crashes, we're able to get what little data is available, although those planes typically don't have the more complex, larger flight data recorders. Usually this information in a case like this is not given voluntarily. It will not be produced voluntarily. Here we are months after, and obviously we've only seen this very small controversial bit of data so far. What we understand, and although we were not privy to the internal communications, but what we understand is that some of the data may have been provided to some of the U.S. regulators. Certainly we understand that all of the data was not given to Boeing. We understand that some may have been shared with the FAA and then in turn with the NTSB. So one of the ways that we can attempt to obtain that data is by starting what's called a FOIA, a Freedom of Information Act request in the United States. We have we have filed that and are waiting for a response. Those responses can take a long time. They're also subject to approval by the various regulators, also can be affected by the status of the investigation and which agency in the U.S. may be involved in the investigation. For example, the NTSB might be able to say, we are not going to produce data because it's an ongoing investigation that we're working in, while another regulator or body in the U.S. might not be able to say that same thing. And so we filed the FOIA to begin the process, to see what the responses are going to be, in hopes, at least, that we can start putting some of this data together. Now, your larger question is, how do you hold a company like Boeing or any other of its size accountable? The U.S. justice system is such that, in theory, it is designed so that a single individual, a single family, can hope to stand on a level playing field with a huge multinational corporation and seek accountability. Seek accountability and transparency and understanding of what happened and how it happened, why it happened, and how to prevent that from happening again. And so, like it or not, these families have earned that right. If the cases can be brought in the United States, these families have earned the right to know why this happened and what happened, and to seek accountability and to seek to try to help keep this from happening to any other family ever again.
Well, all I'll say in the end, Mike, is that, I wish you all luck in this fight, because the families need someone to speak for them, to advocate for them. This is the nature of news is such that we tend to go from one headline to the other, no matter how deeply we try and report something. And I can only imagine the pain, the loneliness, the anguish, the questions that these families have. And hopefully you're representing them with all your experience will get them and all of us, because it impacts all of us, the flying public, some answers. Thank you very much, Mike Andrews. We'll be in touch, and thank you for talking to us.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Take care. It's great to see you here. Thank you for watching our work. If you haven't subscribed yet, don't forget to click the bell icon and subscribe to Mojo Story and support independent, robust journalism.